The fortress is old stone, a remote stronghold whose name is rarely spoken outside the deeds that moulder in the chapel chest. It sits on a rise of granite that the moors creep up to in summer, though you have not seen a true summer moor in 9 months. Now those moors are frozen into low brown waves dusted with the first powder of a heavy snow that began falling some time before dawn. You glance down as you walk and see how the powder fills the gaps between cobbles, sketching the shape of each stone in white. No one has swept it yet. The day is too young, and the storm still too tender. The wind that comes across the battlements has a slap to it, the kind of gust that makes the banners on the gatehouse towers snap once, then fall still, then snap again without rhythm, just the fabric complaining against the pole. You hear that sound every few breaths as you climb the stair to the rampart. The stairs are worn in the center, polished by generations of boots like yours, and you feel the dip under your sole with the familiar ache of a long shift ahead. At the top, the parapet opens out, and the whole northern world spreads before you, the slope of the outer bailey wall dropping to a ditch once full of brambles, now a smooth white hollow, and beyond that the dark smear of the tree line that marks the edge of the forest. Even as you watch, those trees are vanishing. The snow thickens the air into a moving curtain that erases first the farthest branches, then the middle ground, until only the first few twisted oaks remain, their bark blackened with wet. You stand at the merlon and let the flakes collect on the wool of your sleeve, tiny spiked crystals that do not melt at once. You are a guard on the high northern wall, and this is your 3rd winter in this place, but the first that feels as though it intends to bury the world. The master of the watch is already there, a figure in a patched leather coat who stands at the angle where the east curtain meets the tower. He is counting on his fingers, a habit he has when he tallies the stores, and when you draw near, he gives you a nod that communicates nothing except that you are on time. His beard is rimed where his breath has frozen, and he smells of pine resin from the torch he carries to light the brazier. The pass will be shut by midday, he says, his voice a low rumble that the wind carries to you in pieces. You catch the words pass, sut, and midday, and you piece them together with the same calm acceptance you use to piece together a broken bootlace. He looks at you and adds, rations are being counted, as though this is an interesting fact about the weather. You nod, because a reply would require you to unclench your jaw from the cold, and you move to your post. Your post is a section of wall between 2 merlons, about 7 strides long, marked by a faintly darker stone where a mason's apprentice once chiseled a small cross. You have stood here in all weathers and all lights, and you know the cross is there even when you cannot see it. You turn your back to the wind and face the inner ward. From here you can watch the slow stirring of the castle, waking, a stable boy carrying a bucket that steams, a clatter of shutters opening on the chapel dormitory, the first chime of the little bell that calls the kitchen to morning tasks. These sounds come to you muted, softened by the snow that is now falling steadily, not in a rush, but in a patient, vertical drift that fills the air with a million unhurried, white lines. You let your eyes rest on the well cap, a cone of thatch that has gathered a fat round hat of snow. You have seen it do that many times, and each time it looks like a sleepy animal hunched against the cold. The brazier near the far end of the walk hisses when the first fingers of fire catch the tinder your companion has laid with the same methodical care he uses every morning. A nest of dry moss, then shavings, then 3 splits of birch. You do not watch him, but you know the sequence because the sounds tell you the scratch of the flint, the little crack of the kindling, the sudden soft roar as the flame takes. That sound is a comfort you do not name. It simply means that in a few minutes you will be able to press your palms toward a warmth that hardly reaches your face but still matters. You stamp your feet once, twice, a slow rhythm that sends a tremor through the stone, and you settle into the watch. The first hour passes, in the way all first hours pass on the wall, with a slow emptying of thought, a tuning of the senses to the constant small creakings of the fortress. The wind works at the mortar, whistling through a crack near the gatehouse that nobody has patched in, living memory, a note that rises and falls with the gusts. The snow piles in the corners of the crenellations, rounding every sharp angle into something softer. You notice how the light never really brightens. The sun is somewhere beyond the wall-grey lid of cloud, a pale disk that slides unseen from east to west. The afternoon will arrive without a single shadow, a quality of winter that you have come to regard as normal, like the taste of well water or the weight of a spear in your hand. Below, in the kitchens, they are boiling the morning porridge. The smell drifts up in a thin, elusive thread. Oats, a hint of salt, the faintest suggestion of the dried herbs that the cook hoards for the dark months. Your stomach growls once and then quiets, trained by long practice to wait. You watch a single crow flap across the ward and settle on the chapel roof, where it folds its wings and becomes a black bump on the snow. It does not move again for a long while, and you do not look away because there is no reason to look away. The watch is a practice of stillness, of holding the world in your gaze until the world and your gaze become one slow thing. Some time later, you do not count the minutes. The master of the watch climbs the stair again. He carries a slate with chalk marks, the tally of the granary, and you see him erase one number and write a smaller one beneath it. He shows it to the guard at the south post, who shrugs, an answer that suffices for a conversation. The master then comes to you and holds the slate so you can see the new ration for the week. 2 cups of grain per man, 1 strip of dried meat, a thumb-sized lump of tallow. The numbers are written in a careful, square hand that you associate with the long evenings in the guardroom when the same figures are copied into the ledger. You look at the slate and then back at the snow, and you absorb the information without reaction. A smaller ration simply means a warmer cloak and a slower pace, things you already have. The master grunts and walks on, his boots squeaking in the new powder. At midday, which you know only because the kitchen bell rings twice in quick succession, a guard named Bran brings a wooden cup of the promised porridge and a chunk of bread so dense it could be used to chop the gate. You take it with both hands, the bowl warming your fingers through your gloves. The porridge is thick and grey, with small lumps that you chew slowly while you watch the snow continue to fall. It falls on the towers, on the walls, on the gatehouse, on the frozen moat, on the tree line that is now only a memory behind the shifting white veil. It falls without hurry, with the steady, hypnotic persistence of a thing that has all winter to finish its work. You eat every bite and then place the bowl on the stone beside you, where it immediately begins to gather a thin skin of ice on the remaining smear. You will return it when your watch ends. For now, it is simply a small, dark object in a universe of white. After the meal, you walk the length of your section, 7 strides east, pause, turn 7 strides west. You do this not because you are restless, but because the cold settles deeper when you stand still, and the slow movement keeps the blood sluggish but moving in your legs. Each time you reach the end of your stretch, you glance outward over the battlement at the void where the forest used to be. There is no enemy to watch for. The siege is not one of men, but of weather, a vast, patient encircling by the season itself. The pass is blocked, the road beyond is buried, and no messenger can climb through drifts that rise to the height of a horse's withers. You are cut off, and yet the castle does not feel trapped. It feels like a ship at anchor in a calm sea of snow, with no horizon and no destination. Simply waiting because waiting is what ships do. In the early afternoon, the snow slackens to a thin, intermittent fall, individual flakes wandering down as though uncertain they wish to join the rest. The grey lid of sky lightens a fraction, just enough for you to see the faint outline of the mountains to the north, their peaks smoothed like old teeth. The wind turns, backing from north to east, and with the turn carries the smell of more snow to come, a clean, sharp scent that tightens the inside of your nose. You have learned to read that scent as accurately as a fisherman reads the tide. Within 2 hours, it will snow heavily again, and by nightfall the drifts against the outer wall will be deep enough to bury a crouching man. You file this knowledge away without comment, as you file the crack in the merlon that has widened by a finger's width since October. A sound breaks the quiet, a slow, rhythmic scraping from the ward below. You lean out and see 2 grooms shoveling a path from the gatehouse to the well, their wooden blades scraping across cobbles with a sound like a whetstone on a blade. The snow they lift flies in neat arcs and lands on a growing heap that will freeze into a solid mound by morning. They work without speaking, a matched pair of grey-brown shapes moving to a rhythm they have inherited from the men who shoveled before them. You watch them for a while, noting how their breath comes in twin puffs, how they pause together at the exact same moment to wipe their faces with the backs of their sleeves. This small choreography of labor is the only moving picture besides the falling snow, and it is enough to hold your attention until the bell rings again, marking another hour you do not bother to name. As dusk approaches, the light begins to fail in a way that is barely perceptible, a slow thickening of the air from pale grey to the colour of tarnished pewter. The torches are lit in the ward, one by one, their flames stretching tall and steady now that the wind has dropped. You hear the clang of the kitchen door and the cook's voice lifted in a single word, a name that means nothing to you but to which a boy responds by running across the slippery stones. The internal life of the fortress continues in its quiet, layered way, every sound a thread in a tapestry that you have come to know by heart. You stamp your feet again, the motion now so automatic that you are not aware you are doing it until you feel the vibration rise through your knees. The relief arrives on time. A guard named Tam, whose face is so wrapped in a scarf that only the bridge of his nose shows. He gives you a slow blink that serves as greeting, and you step aside so he can take your place at the Merlon. You do not speak, because the handover is a silent ritual. You both know that nothing has happened, that the snow is still falling, that the pass is still shut, that the castle is still afloat in its white sea. You hand him the bowl that you picked up earlier, since it belongs to his shift now, and you walk to the stair with the heavy, deliberate step of a man whose legs are stiff from standing. At the bottom of the stair, you pause and look up at the sky one last time before entering the keep. The flakes are still coming down, swirling in the torchlight like moths around a flame. You notice how they catch the orange glow and turn briefly golden before settling on the stone, where they resume their ordinary white. The entire world is hushed, not with the silence of emptiness, but with the deep, listening silence of a place that has accepted winter as a long guest. You pull the door open and step inside, leaving the cold for a moment, though you know you will return to it before dawn. Behind you, the snow continues to fall, patient and endless, sealing the fortress into its own small, quiet story. You take your post on the wall in the late evening, when the last grey trace of day has drained from the sky and left behind a perfect darkness that the torches in the ward do nothing to soften. The shift is the second watch, which runs from the hour after supper until the bell strikes midnight, a span you know less by the clock than by the feel of the air changing texture as the night deepens. You climb the stair with a slow, heavy-footed rhythm, one hand on the rope rail that threads through iron rings set in the stone, and at the top you pause to let your eyes adjust to the world reduced to shades of black and faint orange from the brazier glowing at the far end of the walk. The wind has dropped since the afternoon, leaving a stillness that presses on your ears like a thick cloth, and the only sound is the hiss of coals settling, a soft whisper that seems to come from everywhere at once. You begin your patrol not with a conscious decision, but because patrol is what a guard does, and your legs know the route without instruction. The length of the parapet stretches ahead of you as a darker ribbon against the dark sky, its edges marked by the blunt teeth of the merlons that you can count blind. 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to the tower at the east corner. You walk at a pace that is neither hurried nor dawdling, a steady tread that measures out the time in units of a bootful, and with each step your attention flows outward to the great emptiness beyond the wall, a void where the forest was and now is only a memory of a shape behind the snow. There is nothing to see, and you do not expect to see anything, because the siege has brought no enemy, only the quiet, continuous presence of winter holding the pass and the roads and the valleys in its grip. So your glance is not a searching glance, but an acknowledging one, a slow sweep from left to right that confirms what you already know. The world is asleep under a blanket of white. At the first Merlon you stop, not because you have a reason, but because stopping is part of the rhythm. You place your gloved hand on the stone, its surface rough and familiar, and you feel the cold travel up through the leather in a slow, blunt ache. The stone has a memory of all the hands that have touched it, and your hand joins that memory, while you stand there breathing out small clouds that vanish without ceremony. You look down at the outer face of the wall, tracing the line where a crack runs from the crenel down into shadow, a crack you have watched widen over the months, and you note that now a thin ribbon of ice fills it. catching the barest gleam from a torch somewhere below. This observation occupies a moment that stretches without urgency, and then you turn and walk on. 3 strides carry you to the next merlon, where the iron bracket that once held a torch is empty and cold, a loop of rusted metal bent like a question mark. You touch that too, a quick tap of your knuckle that produces a faint, dull ring absorbed immediately by the snow lying thick on the parapet floor. The snow here has been packed down by the day's patrols into a hard, uneven crust that crunches under your soles with a sound like walking on nutshells, a sound that becomes part of the night's music just as the creak of the gatehouse hinge and the distant thud of a shutter closing are part of its music. You count your steps without meaning to, a habit that has grown on you during long watches, and when you reach the tower you have paced out 112 steps from the stairhead to the east curtain. 112, the same number it has been since the first snow, and you file that fact away with the mild satisfaction of the person who likes things to remain true. At the tower you turn and lean your back against the stone, facing inward now, to study the castle's inner life as it settles into night. The ward is a dim bowl of shadows, its cobbles hidden under a fresh layer of powder that sparkles in the torchlight with a faint, sugary glint. The kitchen door opens, and a sliver of warm yellow spills out, then closes again as a boy scuttles across to the storehouse carrying a covered pot, his feet leaving a trail of dark prints that will fill with snow before the next bell. You watch him without watching, your gaze soft and unfocused, and the image of his hurrying figure is replaced a few breaths later by the slow progress of a cat that picks its way along the base of the chapel wall, its tail held high as a banner. The cat stops, licks a paw, and then disappears into the shadows under the buttress, leaving you with the uninterrupted view of falling snowflakes descending one by one into the torchlit circles scattered across the yard. Each flake is a tiny white signal from the sky, and they fall in such numbers that your eyes lose them in a kind of gentle, moving fog. The brazier calls you back to the outer wall, its warmth a dull red glow that you can feel on your cheeks when you approach. Bran, the guard who brought your porridge in the morning, is there this evening, tending the coals with a long iron poker that he uses to stir the embers into a brief, brighter life. He hums as he works, a half-forgotten tune that might be a harvest song or a marching cadence, its melody so worn smooth by repetition that it has become just a series of notes without beginning or end. You do not know the words, if there ever were words, but the humming fills the silence in a way that is pleasant, like the sound of water running under ice, and you stand near the brazier with your hands held out, feeling the heat seep through your gloves in slow, heavy waves. Bran looks up and meets your eye for a fraction of a breath, then returns his attention to the coals, and you understand that this is the extent of your conversation for the night, a silent agreement that everything is as it should be. The moon appears as a pale smudge high behind the clouds, a shapeless glimmer that cannot break through the overcast, but that still casts a diluted, milky light across the snowfields beyond the wall. In that faint luminescence you can just make out the swoop of the terrain, the way the ditch becomes a smooth white hollow and then rises toward the tree line that is no longer a line, but a series of dark bumps where the tallest firs still poke through the drifts. The sight is so familiar that it is like looking at the back of your own hand, and yet each night it has a small difference. Tonight the wind has sculpted the snow into long, low waves that curve like the ribs of a buried giant, forms that were not there yesterday and will be gone tomorrow when the new snow reshapes them again. You observe this with the detached interest of someone watching water in a basin tilt back and forth, and then you let your gaze drift upward to the clouds, which are moving very slowly, a vast grey migration from west to east. A gust of wind finds the crack near the gatehouse and produces a low whistle that rises a half note and then fades, a sound that you have heard so many times that it has become part of the wall's personality, a voice that speaks only of winter. The gust also shakes the banners on the tower, though you cannot see them from here, and you hear the heavy fabric give one weary flap before settling again into silence. You shift your weight from one foot to the other, a small adjustment that relieves the pressure on your hips, and you feel the cold stone pressing back through your boots, a reminder that the fortress is alive in its way, holding its shape against the siege of the season. The cold has a presence tonight, not the biting, wind-driven cold of the day, but a still, deep cold that creeps into the joints of your armor and the weave of your cloak. making everything stiff and slow, as though the air itself were thickening into syrup. The kitchen bell rings once, a single soft note that tells you an hour has passed, though which hour you do not bother to calculate. You watch Bran take a small leather pouch from his belt and tip a few dried leaves into his palm, which he then drops onto the coals. A thin, aromatic smoke curls up, carrying the scent of something herbal and green, a memory of the summer garden that is now buried under snow. The smoke stings your eyes for a moment and then disperses, leaving behind a faint, pleasant bitterness that mixes with the cold air and the smell of hot iron. Neither of you speaks, because the scent is its own communication, a small offering to the night that requires no reply. After a time, Bran picks up his spear from where it leans against the merlon and moves off toward the south end of the walk, his footsteps crunching away into silence, leaving you alone with the brazier and the moon smudge and the wide, waiting dark. You resume your slow patrol, walking now with no particular aim beyond the need to keep the blood moving, and as you walk, you let your mind drift into a state that is neither sleep nor waking, a hovering awareness that registers everything without reacting to it. You note the texture of the snow underfoot, now softer where a fresh dusting has fallen since your last pass. You note the way the brazier's glow paints the merlons, a faint, rosy orange on one side while leaving the other in absolute shadow. You note the fact that your own breath has settled into a steady rhythm that matches your footsteps, a duet of living sound in the midst of the great, inorganic quiet. You do not think about the future, nor do you reminisce about the past. You simply exist inside the moment, which is a long, unrolling scroll of tiny perceptions. You find yourself at the stairhead again, and you pause there to look up at the sky as if expecting a change. The clouds have thinned a little, or perhaps your eyes have simply adjusted, because you can now see a few stars through the gauze, pale and unblinking, arranged in the patterns you learned from a previous guard who is no longer here. You find the cluster that marks the hunter, its 3 belt stars tilted almost vertical at this hour, and you trace the line of his bow with a slow movement of your finger against the dark. The stars offer no warmth and no answers, but they are constants, and you appreciate them in the same way you appreciate the 112 steps, as a quiet order beneath the disorder of snow and wind. A single bright point detaches itself from the pattern and streaks across a thumb width of sky, a meteor so swift you might have imagined it, and you watch the place where it was for a long moment before lowering your gaze back to the wall. The shutter on the chapel dormitory closes somewhere below, a soft thump of wood on stone that marks the bedtime of the younger members of the household. You have heard that sound every night of this winter, and its occurrence now slots into the timeline of your watch with the ease of a key turning in a lock. You know that after the shutter comes the distant murmur of the castle's inhabitants settling into their straw pallets, a murmur that you cannot actually hear from here, but that you know is happening because it always happens, and then the final patrol of the dogs in the inner ward, a brief scuffle of claws as they circle their sleeping spots near the hearth. These predictable events unfold in your mind even as you stand motionless, a shadow among shadows, and the knowledge of them is a comfort that requires no examination. Your legs carry you back to the brazier, where you find that the coals have burned down to a bed of soft grey ash, with a few stubborn embers still winking like sleepy eyes. You take the poker, its handle wrapped in fraying twine, and you stir the ashes with care, uncovering a hidden core of heat that glows a sudden, rich orange before settling back. Then you open the small iron box that sits beside the brazier, the box that holds extra charcoal wrapped in cloth, and you lay 2 lumps on the embers with the tongs. The charcoal catches after a moment, its edges crackling into tiny flames that lick upward like waking creatures, and you close the box and return the poker to its place. This act of tending the fire fills a space of time that might otherwise have felt empty, and you are grateful for it in a mild, wordless way. The watch continues, and the silence of the night deepens until it has a texture, a weight that presses evenly on everything. Into this silence, the fortress slowly reveals its inner noises. You hear the creak of the gatehouse door settling into its frame, a sound that travels up through the stone as a vibration rather than a noise. You hear the distant, rhythmic drip of water from a leak in the wellhouse roof, a single drop every few heartbeats that plinks into a catch basin with a tiny musical note. You hear the scuttle of a mouse somewhere in the straw beneath the storehouse floor, a rapid scratching rustle that stops abruptly and then resumes after a pause, as though the mouse is listening for danger. These sounds are all so familiar that they have become part of your internal landscape, a quiet music that lulls without ever quite lulling you to sleep. At some point the bell strikes 3 times, the signal for midnight, and you hear the change in the atmosphere before you see the relief. A stirring in the stairwell, a low cough, the scuff of a new pair of boots on the worn steps. Tem emerges from the shadow, his face rapt, as always, and he gives you the slow blink that passes for acknowledgement. You step aside from the brazier, holding out the poker so he can take it, and he does so with a nod that barely moves his hood. The handover is silent, as it always is, because there are no incidents to report, no alarms, no movements on the snowfield, nothing but the steady accumulation of cold and darkness on the longest night of the year. You feel the tiredness now, an ache behind your eyes and a heaviness in your legs that you had not noticed while you were moving. And you turn to the stair with the grateful knowledge that your watch is complete. You walk down the stair with one hand on the rope rail, your steps careful on the worn stone that is slick with a film of ice. The air in the ward is sharper than the air on the wall, cutting into your lungs as you cross to the barracks door, but the promise of warmth pulls you forward. You pause once at the door to glance back at the wall, where Tam's silhouette is just visible against the faint glow of the brazier, a dark shape that might be any guard of any winter, and then you push the door open and step inside, leaving the night to its quiet, patient work. Behind you, the snow begins to fall a little heavier, filling your footprints even before the door swings shut. A fortnight passes as you measure time not by dates, but by the rising drifts that lean against the outer wall, and one morning you wake to a world that has swallowed the Bailey in white to your knees. The snow has fallen each night with a steady, patient insistence, flake by flake, piling on the frozen crust until every familiar contour of the yard is softened into a single unbroken sweep. You step out of the barracks door and your boot sinks past the ankle into powder that squeaks under your weight, a sound so dry and compact that it might be the voice of the cold itself. The air is still and holds a particular silence, the kind that comes when fresh snow has smothered every echo and left only the immediate rasp of your own breath inside your hood. Across the ward, the well cap has become a smooth, white dome, twice its usual size. The chapel steps are only a faint suggestion of angles, and the gatehouse doors wear heavy white brows that droop over the iron hinges. The grey stone of the keep rises out of this whiteness like a ship from a frozen sea, and you join the other guards who are already forming a slow, silent line outside the tool shed where the wooden shovels are stored. Your duties have shifted with the deepening drifts, for while the wall still requires its steady watch, the bigger task now is to carve pathways through the snow so the fortress can continue its quiet life. The master of the watch hands out the shovels one by one, their handles worn smooth and dark from years of use, and each guard takes his place in a line that stretches from the gatehouse to the well, from the well to the tower stair. There is no command given, no signal beyond the first scrape of a blade on cobblestone, and then the work begins with a rhythm as old as winter itself. Your shovel bites into the drift with a soft crunch, and you lift a bladeful of snow that weighs almost nothing, a feather-light scoop of crystals that sparkles for an instant before you toss it aside onto the growing heap. The wooden edge scrapes across stone with a long, low sound that is more vibration than noise, a hushed rumble that joins the other scrapes into a chorus of slow labor. Beside you, another guard is working at the same deliberate pace, his shovel rising and falling with a steady, sleepwalking cadence, and the two of you move forward side by side without needing to speak, because the work is its own conversation. The line progresses inch by inch across the ward, a human chain that pushes the snow into a series of neat mounds on either side of the emerging path. Each time your shovel empties, the snow falls onto the heap with a soft, breathy collapse, a sound that is almost a sigh, as if the snow itself is grateful to be rearranged. The cold wraps around your face and numbs the tip of your nose, but your body beneath the wool and leather generates a warmth that rises through your tunic in faint wisps, steam curling from your collar every time you bend and lift. You see the same steam rising from the other guards, little clouds that bloom and vanish above each man, merging into a thin haze that hangs over the working line like a ghost of industry. You pause for a moment to straighten your back and the ache that runs from your shoulders to your hips is a dull, familiar weight that reminds you of every morning after a storm, a pleasant tiredness that has no urgency. The world around you has shed its color during these weeks, becoming a study in monochrome. The stone of the walls is a deep, wet grey that darkens where the wind has plastered snow against the mortar, and the ground under the fresh paths is a paler grey of old ice and packed slush. Above, the sky is a single sheet of pearl-white cloud that diffuses the light into a shadowless, even glow, so that neither you nor the walls cast any mark on the ground. Your own hand, when you look down at it gripping the shovel, appears as a study in greys and faded browns, the leather of your glove blending into the wood, into the snow. The only colour in the whole world is the faintest pink of the sky just before sunset, and that is hours away yet, so you work inside a painting made of charcoal and chalk, and the simplicity of it rests your mind as much as the silence does. When the path to the well is clear enough for a single man to walk with a bucket, the line of shovels turns its attention to the route between the gatehouse and the tower. This path rises in a gentle slope that the snow has filled into a smooth ramp, and you dig into it with the thick of your blade, cutting steps that you then flatten into a walkway. Your shovel finds an old boot print frozen into the ice beneath the fresh powder, a perfect mould of a heel and toe that must have been left during the last clearing and then swallowed overnight. You pause to look at it, noting the way the ice has preserved every wrinkle of the leather sole, and then you scrape it away with a single sweep that erases the proof of yesterday as if it never existed. The work is repetitive in a way that soothes. Each stroke of the shovel, a small disappearance of the present. Each step forward, a slight reclamation of the castle from the siege of snow. A crow has been watching from the naked branch of the old elm that leans over the chapel roof, its feathers ruffled into a black puff against the pale sky. You notice it during a brief rest, when you lean your shovel against the wall and step to a loophole in the gatehouse to look out at the cold world beyond. The crow is so still it might be carved, its head tucked low, its eyes two black beads that occasionally blink with a slow sideways motion. The branch it perches on is a dark scribble, every twig etched in perfect clarity against the snow-crusted roof tiles, and as you watch the bird fluffs its feathers outward with a rapid shake, then settles back into sleep. No sound reaches you from the outside, because the snow has buried the moors under a hush that swallows even the caw of a crow. You watch for a while longer, your breath fogging the loophole's stone edge, and then you return to your shovel, leaving the bird to its solitary vigil. By midday the paths are clear enough that a cartwheel could turn without catching, and the shovels are returned to the shed, where they lean against the wall in a dark row, dripping slowly onto the straw. You stamp the snow from your boots on the guardroom threshold, and step into a warmth that hits your face like a soft cloth. The air thick with the smell of oat porridge and the faint tang of the tallow candles that gutter on the mantelpiece. A wooden bowl is pressed into your hands, its sides hot enough to sting your chilled fingers, and the porridge inside is the same grey-brown as the stones you have been shoveling, studded with the occasional darker lump of unground barley. You take a spoonful and taste salt, the ghost of rosemary, and the bland, filling weight of oats that have boiled for hours until they became a substance more like mortar than food, and it is exactly what your body needs. Beside the porridge, there is a hunk of hard bread, its crust so thick you must crack it with your teeth, and a sliver of salted fish that glistens faintly on a wooden board. The fish is the color of old copper, fibrous and intensely salty, and you eat it in tiny bites between mouthfuls of porridge, the salt cutting through the blandness in a way that makes both things better. The guards eat together in a loose circle, some sitting on upturned barrels and others on the floor with their backs against the wall, and no one speaks above a murmur, because speaking requires energy that is better saved for the afternoon. The only full voice belongs to old Willem, a guard whose grey beard reaches his belt, who has taken up the daily reading from the castle ledger as if it were a holy text. The ledger he reads from is a thick, leather-bound book that lives on a shelf in the storeroom, its pages filled with the careful script of quartermasters long dead. Today he opens it to a section titled Summer Harvest Accounts, Year of the Red Steer, and he begins to read aloud in a voice that rumbles like a distant cart on cobbles. He reads of the wheat yield from the east field, 46 bushels of good dry grain, and the barley from the terraces below the chapel, 31 bushels with a note about the sweetness of the straw. He reads of the pear harvest in the orchard beyond the moat, a list of counts and weights that goes on for half a page, and the number of cabbages that were salted into the big crock in the undercroft. Each entry is a small dry fact delivered in a monotone that lulls the room into a trance, and you find your spoons slowing as the numbers wash over you, the warm porridge settling in your stomach, while the voice continues through turnips, leeks, and the notable abundance of currants in the kitchen garden. The summer he describes as a distant country, one where the sun baked the stone walls until they radiated heat and the air smelled of cut grass and dusty earth. And you try to remember what that felt like while the winter wind rattles the shutter. After the meal, the guards disperse to the afternoon duties, and yours takes you back to the wall for a short watch while the paths below remain empty. The clouds have thinned enough to let a pale disk of sun show through, a circle of weak lemon light that hangs low over the western peaks. That light falls on the snowfields outside the wall and turns them into a vast, blinding sheet of white that hurts to look at, so you face inward instead and study the castle as it dozes under its white blanket. Smoke rises from the kitchen chimney in a straight column, undisturbed by any breeze, and the crows have multiplied to 3 now, settling on different parts of the roof like notes on a musical staff. The silence is no longer the deep silence of the night, but a day silence, a quiet filled with tiny distant sounds, the drip of melting snow from a sunny patch of roof, the clink of a bucket bailed from the well, the click of the gatehouse door latch as someone goes through. All of these sounds are wrapped in wool, buffered by the snow so that they reach your ears as mere suggestions, soft and indistinct. You stand your watch without moving much, one hand resting on the cold stone of a merlon, and you let your mind drift over the events of the morning, the scrape of the shovel, the steam rising from your collar, the copper taste of the salted fish, the string of numbers from the ledger. They merge into a single, seamless memory of a day that is neither good nor bad, simply a day like all the others, and you feel a quiet contentment settle over you that has nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with the absence of struggle. The siege continues, but the siege is only snow, and snow can be shoveled. It falls, you clear it. It falls again, and in that cycle there is a kind of peace that needs no explanation. As the afternoon deepens, the sun retreats behind the mountains and the temperature drops sharply, a signal that the second shoveling shift will soon be needed because the paths are already beginning to blur under a fresh dusting. You turn at the sound of boots on the stair and see the next guard coming to relieve you, his shovel already in hand because the line will reassemble shortly. You step aside and he takes your place, his eyes crinkling above his scarf in what might be a smile, and you descend the same stair you climbed in the dark of the morning. The ward below is a little darker now, the shadows stretching long and thin across the crusted snow, and the paths you carved earlier are already softened at the edges, their sharp lines dissolving back into the drift. That is a task for the next hour, and for now you walk to the guardroom where the fire crackles and the ledger still lies open on the table, waiting for old Willem to resume his reading before supper. The quiet wraps itself around you like a second cloak, and you let it hold you all the way inside. The chalk clicks against the slate in short, dry taps that you have come to associate with the hour before supper, when the quartermaster stands at his tall desk in the storeroom and marks the new allowances for the day. You file in with the other guards, a loose column of bodies wrapped in wool and smelling of cold stone, shuffling forward through the low doorway, one by one, into a room lit by a single tallow candle that gutters in a draught you cannot feel. The flame bends and straightens, casting a warm orange glow across the quartermaster's face and the slate propped before him, where he has written in a careful square hand the numbers that will govern your next meal. 2 cups of grain per man, 1 strip of dried meat, a thumb-sized lump of tallow for the lamps. The tallow is not for eating but for burning, a fact you have known since the first winter when you tried to chew a sliver and spat it into the fire. You accept the numbers without comment, because commenting would not change them, and anyway the rations are smaller now than they were a month ago, but still enough to keep a man standing on a wall through a long cold watch. The line moves forward with the slow shuffling rhythm of a cart in mud, each guard stepping up to the counter, holding out a wooden cup that the quartermaster's assistant fills with 2 level scoops of greyish grain from a sack that leans against the wall like a sleeping guest. The grain pours into your cup with a soft, rustling hiss, each kernel making a tiny tap against the wood that blends into a single steady sound, and you watch the pail stream until it stops exactly at the brim, where the assistant's thumb levels it with a practiced swipe. Next to you, Bran receives his own cup, and the two of you move aside to the second station, where a different attendant, a thin young man with ink stains on his fingers, lays a single dark strip of dried meat across your open palm. The meat is tough and fibrous, the color of old mahogany, and it curls slightly at the edges like a dried leaf. You tuck it into your belt pouch, where it will live until you soak it in your evening porridge, a ritual that softens the leathery fibers into something you can chew without straining your jaw. Then comes the tallow lump, a pale, waxy nub that the attendant drops into your cup with a small plop that makes the grain jump, and you curl your fingers around it to keep it from rolling out. The tallow has a faint, animal smell, a reminder of the mutton stews of autumn that now seem like a story from another life. The line continues to move, and as you shuffle toward the door you pass through a pocket of warm air that drifts from the charcoal brazier in the corner, a brief gift of heat that flushes your cheeks before the cold of the corridor reclaims them. You pause just outside the storeroom, leaning your shoulder against the stone wall while you wait for the other guards to finish drawing their portions, and the corridor around you fills with low, murmuring voices that blend together like the sound of a distant hive. No one speaks loudly, both because the cold swallows sound and because there is no need. The conversations of the same ones held every evening, gentle lists of small observations and small complaints that serve no purpose beyond filling the silence. Someone remarks that the salt in the fish has grown more potent, that it stings the tongue like a bee, and another voice answers that a man who eats salt will drink more water, and water is still free from the well, so perhaps the quartermaster is clever after all. This prompts a soft, wheezing laugh that might be old Willem, and then a third guard mentions the sour ale from the last barrel, how it has turned so sharp that it puckers the cheeks, and how he misses the taste of rosemary from the herb garden that is now buried under drifts so deep the plants will not reappear until the snow melts in the spring. You listen without adding your own words, because the herb garden is a shared memory among all of you, a small square of green behind the chapel where you once sat in the sun while the bees worked the lavender, and the thought of it now is like a picture you take out and look at before putting it away again. The rosemary, someone says, grew next to the sage and the thyme, and the cook would snip sprigs of it into the stew all through the harvest season, so that every meal carried a faint, piney note that reminded you of the forest even when you were inside. You remember that taste now, how it lingered on the back of your tongue after the bowl was empty, and you compare it to the flat, salty meals of winter and find the comparison neither good nor bad, simply a fact of the changing year. Another voice adds that the mint was the first to go, dying back in the first frost, and that the parsley held on under a cloak of straw until the heavy snow collapsed it into a frozen mat. These small agricultural reports drift around the corridor like the smoke from the tallow candles, and you absorb them with the same passive attention you give to the weather, noting them and letting them pass. After a while the conversation fades because there is only so much to say about a garden that is asleep under 6 feet of snow, and the guards begin to drift away one by one, carrying their wooden cups to the guardroom or the barracks or the chapel where a kettle of water will soon boil over the hearth. You take your own cup to the guardroom, where the long table has been set with a row of clay bowls and a single iron pot suspended over the fire. The water inside is already trembling with the approach of a boil, small bubbles clinging to the sides of the pot and then releasing in lazy streams that wobble to the surface and pop silently. You tip your grain into a bowl, listening to the cascade of kernels against clay, and then you set the tallow aside on the little shelf where it will be collected later, for the lamp maker. The dried meat you lower into the bowl as well, where it will wait until the hot water softens it into something close to edible. All around you the other guards are doing the same. A quiet choreography of pouring and placing, and the only sounds are the clink of bowls, the hiss of the fire, and the slow, steady breathing of men who have been cold all day and are now beginning to thaw. You take your seat on the bench, your back against the wall, and you watch the fire flicker across the faces opposite you while the water boils. When the water is ready, a guard named Tam carries the pot around the table, tilting a careful stream of steaming liquid into each bowl. The water darkens the grain instantly, releasing a faint, wholesome smell of warm oats that fills the guardroom and pushes back the tallow tang. You stir the mixture with the handle of your spoon, watching the dried meat soften and begin to bleed a little color into the porridge, a dark, rich stain that swirls through the grey like ink in water. Then you wait, because the grain needs time to absorb the heat, and waiting is a skill you have all cultivated. You hold the warm bowl against your chest, letting the heat seep through the clay into your hands and your chest, and you close your eyes for a moment while the murmur of conversation rises again, this time about the stars. Someone has been outside and reports that the cloud cover has torn open for the first time in weeks, revealing a sky so thick with stars that it looks like a spill of salt across a dark table. This news travels around the table, and you open your eyes and file it away for later, because you will be on the wall for the night watch, and you want to see for yourself. The stars have been hidden for so long that you have almost forgotten how they look. Their cold, steady light, their patterns that turn slowly through the winter months like a great wheel. You spoon up the first mouthful of porridge, its heat spreading down your throat and into your stomach, and you let the conversation about stars carry you toward the end of the meal. After the bowls are scraped clean and stacked in a leaning tower beside the hearth, the guards disperse to their evening duties, and you begin the slow walk toward the stair that leads to the north wall. The cold in the ward is sharper than before, a clean, dry blade of air that slices through your cloak the moment you step outside. But above you the sky has indeed opened, and the stars are so bright they seem to tremble. You pause at the foot of the stair, tilting your head back to take in the whole sweep of the heavens, and you note that the Milky Way is a broad, glowing river from horizon to horizon, its edges soft as wool. The sight is so vast and so unchanged from every other clear night of your life that it settles something in you, a tiny anchor in the drifting sea of winter. You climb the stair with your gaze still lifted, nearly stumbling on the worn step by the crack, and you reach the parapet still blinking at the cosmos. The guard you are relieving, a young man whose name you can never remember, nods once and then disappears down the stair, leaving you alone with the stars and the cold and the black silhouette of the mountains. The brazier glows beside you, a mound of embers that pulses faintly with each small breath of wind, and you stand close enough to feel the heat on one side while the other side stays exposed to the deep, freezing dark. Your breath rises in steady clouds, and you note how the starlight catches the edges of the vapor and turns them faintly silver before they vanish. The constellations unfold above you in their familiar order. You find the hunter first, his belt 3 bright points in a perfect row, his shoulders and knees the paler stars that connect the dots into a shape you learned as a child. From there you trace the line of his bow arm, which points toward the bull, a cluster of stars with one bright, reddish eye that glares down at you with a steady, unblinking patience. You follow the bull's horns upward and find the 7 sisters huddled together like a tiny cloud of light, so close that you can only separate them by looking slightly away and letting your eye drift. You name each one in your mind, reciting the list in a slow chant that matches the rhythm of your breath, and when you have finished you move on to the plough and the pole star, and the winding river of the dragon that curls between them. The naming is a quiet ritual that occupies your attention fully and empties your thoughts of everything except the patterns and the dark spaces between them. The sky is so clear tonight that you can see the faintest stars, the ones that usually hide behind the smallest haze. And the longer you look, the more you see, a steady population of points of light that increases with every heartbeat until the whole dome above you seems to be a kind of dark field planted with infinite white seeds. A single satellite brightens and fades in the space between 2 constellations, a tiny traveler crossing an ocean of black, and you watch its arc without feeling any need to know what it is. It simply is, a moving point in a still picture, and then it is gone. Below you, the castle sleeps in its blanket of snow. The roofs are smooth and dark, the torches in the ward have guttered to a single point, and the gatehouse is a solid block of shadow that anchors the southern end of the wall. From that direction comes a tiny, almost inaudible sound, the soft creak of cooling timber as the wooden beams of the gatehouse settle into the deeper cold of the night. You listen to it, a single note that lasts for a second and then stops, replaced by the fainter creak of another beam somewhere in the tower. The fortress is always talking in these small voices, its stones and timbers contracting in the cold, like an old man settling his bones into a chair, and you listen without alarm because the sounds are as regular as your own heartbeat. A creak comes from the gatehouse, then a pause of several breaths, then a creak from the tower, then a pause, and in between the pauses the silence is so deep that you can hear the blood moving in your ears. The stars wheel overhead with an imperceptible motion, and you turn slowly on the spot, tracing the whole circle of the horizon. The mountains to the north are black paper cutouts pasted against a star-scattered sheet, their ridges sharp and jagged where the snow has filled the crevices. To the south the land falls away into the valleys that lead to the lowlands, and you can see the faint glimmer of a frozen river winding through the dark like a dropped ribbon. In summer that river would be a seam of silver, noisy with meltwater and the calls of birds, but now it is only a suggestion of a shape, a curve of deeper black on black. You turn back to the brazier and stir the coals with the poker, watching the red glow bloom and fade, and then you resume your slow patrol along the parapet. Your boots crunch on the packed snow in a rhythm as steady as the creaking timbers, and you count your steps again, 112 to the tower, 112 back. The numbers are a comfort, a proof that the world continues in its orderly way, despite the siege and the snow and the shrinking rations. When you reach the tower for the third time, you lean against the merlon and look down into the ward, where a single light burns in the chapel window, a warm yellow square that means the chapel keeper is still awake, perhaps reading from the same ledger that old Willem reads from in the guardroom. The light is so small and so far away that it seems like a star that has fallen to earth and lodged in the stone, and you watch it for a long while without thinking anything in particular. The night deepens and the cold deepens with it, pressing against your face until your cheeks feel like polished wood. You pull your scarf higher and adjust your hood so that only your eyes are exposed, and you keep moving, walking, pausing, turning, in a cycle that fills the hours with a kind of motionless motion. The creaking timbers below you continue their slow conversation, and you note each one as it comes. The gatehouse beam with its thin, high note, the tower beam with its lower grumble, the stable beam that you can just hear from here with a soft, splintery crackle. These sounds are the night's only clock, and by them you know that the watch is passing, minute by minute, into the deep pocket of time that belongs only to the stars. At some point, the bell rings for midnight, 3 clear notes that hang on the cold air, and you hear the expected footsteps on the stair. The relief arrives wrapped in frost-stiffened wool, and you pass the poker into a gloved hand with a nod. You walk down the stair, your legs stiff, your eyelids heavy, and you pause once in the ward to look up at the stars, one last time before you push open the barracks door. The sky is unchanged, still crackling with light, still turning its slow wheel, and you carry the image of it into the warm dark room where you will sleep until the next duty calls. All is steady, and the steady continues on. The cold arrives not as a single event, but as a gradual thickening of the air, a change that you notice first in the way your breath begins to hang in front of your face for a full second longer before it fades. You wake one morning to find that the inside of the barracks window, a narrow slit of horn set in the stone, has bloomed with a garden of frost flowers. Their delicate fern-like patterns that curl across the pane in spiraling tendrils, each frond a tiny feather of ice that catches the grey dawn light and holds it trapped inside the crystal. You lie on your pallet and study them without rising, tracing the way one pattern begins as a central stem and then branches and branches again, until the whole window is a frozen forest in miniature, white on grey, intricate as lace. The sight is so familiar that you do not remark on it, but each morning the frost flowers are different, shaped by the night's particular combination of moisture and cold, and you have come to regard them as the winter's way of leaving a small, silent message on the glass. Today, the message is a series of overlapping fans that remind you of the ferns that grow beside the stream in summer, and you file that thought next to the other summer thoughts that you keep on a high shelf in your mind. When you swing your legs off the pallet and set your bare feet on the floor, the stone bites upward through the straw matting with a sharp, immediate shock that travels from your soles to your ankles and makes you draw a quick breath, even through the leather soles of your boots, which you pull on with hurried, stiff-fingered movements. The cold of the granite persists as a dull, blunt pressure that you will feel all day, a constant reminder that the fortress is built on and of the mountain, and the mountain never warms. You stamp your feet twice to wake them, and the sound is a hollow thud that echoes in the low room while the other guards stir around you, pulling on their own boots with the same automatic economy of motion. No one speaks, because the first words of the day are always the hardest to form, and anyway the cold has a way of making speech seem unnecessary, a luxury that costs warmth you would rather keep. The guardroom half is the first destination for every man, and you join the loose knot of bodies that huddle around it while the night-spanked coals are prodded back to life. The ritual of the warming stones begins here, at the edge of the fire, where a pile of smooth river rocks sits in a battered iron basket. These stones were collected from the stream bed during the autumn, each one chosen for its size and shape, roughly the span of 2 hands pressed together, and now they are the castle's mobile warmth, carried to every cold post in a rotation that has become as regular as the bell. You select a stone from the basket, its surface dark and cool to the touch, and you place it on the hearthstones close to the flames so that it can drink the heat while you break your fast. Around you a dozen other stones are doing the same, arrayed in a crescent before the fire like a congregation of dark, patient worshippers. The morning meal is a thin porridge today, the grain ration reduced again so that the substance in your bowl is more water than oats, a pale, cloudy liquid that you drink rather than eat. It warms your throat and settles in your stomach with a faint, distant fullness, and you wash it down with a cup of hot water that has been steeped with a single dried mint leaf from the cook's hoard. The mint is a ghost of a flavor, barely there, but it reminds your tongue that other tastes exist beyond salt and grain, and you hold the cup with both hands while the heat seeps into your palms. When the porridge is gone and the cup is empty, you take up a square of rough sacking from the pile beside the hearth and wrap it around the stone, which has now grown hot enough to sting if you hold it bare. The sacking is frayed at the edges, and it carries the slightly scorched smell of all the other mornings it has been used for this same purpose, a smell that is part smoke, and part wool, and part something else, something clean and mineral that you associate with the stones themselves. You tuck the wrapped stone against your chest, beneath your cloak and your outer tunic, where it presses against your sternum like a second, warmer heart. The heat radiates outward in slow, heavy waves that travel down your arms and up toward your throat, and you feel your shoulders drop half an inch as the cold that had lodged there during the night begins to loosen its grip. Other guards are doing the same, settling their stones into the folds of their clothing with small adjustments of cloth and belt, and then the group disperses out into the ward with a collective exhalation of steam that rises like a signal into the grey air. The inner walls are where the frost flowers grow in their greatest profusion. As you walk the short distance to your morning post, you pass a section of stone that faces north and never receives direct light. And here the frost has formed a tapestry so dense and elaborate that it stops you for a moment. The crystals have spread across the granite in a series of overlapping circles, each one a mandala of tiny branching needles that interlock with their neighbors, and the effect is of a dozen frozen spiderwebs laid over one another in a pattern that no human hand could trace. You reach out a gloved finger and touch the edge of one formation, and the crystals crumble instantly into a smear of white dust that leaves a dark, wet print on the stone. By tomorrow morning the frost will have reclaimed that spot, growing new crystals out of the moisture in the air, and you will not be able to tell where you touched. This endless, patient repair is something you have observed many times, and it always leaves you with a quiet sense of the world's indifference and its persistence, two qualities that the winter has taught you to find reassuring rather than bleak. Your shift takes you to the east parapet today, a section of wall that catches the first light when the sun manages to break through the clouds, which it has not done in a week. You stand at your merlon with the warming stone a steady comfort against your chest, and you look out over a landscape that has frozen into a kind of sculpture. The snow that fell last week has hardened into a crust that glitters faintly, and the trees at the edge of the forest are now locked inside sleeves of clear ice from the freezing rain that followed the snow. When the wind stirs, the branches do not sway, but instead produce a thin, glassy clatter, the sound of ice striking ice, a delicate music that carries across the moat and up to your ears in fragments. The wind itself is a low, continuous moan that threads through the battlements with a voice that rises and falls but never quite goes silent, a sound so constant that you have learned to hear it without hearing it, the way you hear your own pulse when you stop to listen. The morning passes in the slow, measured way that cold mornings pass, each minute stretched thin by the effort of staying warm. You shift the warming stone from your chest to your back for a while, feeling the heat soak into the muscles beside your spine, and then you tuck it under your arm while you walk a short patrol. The stone will not hold its heat forever. By midday it will be merely lukewarm, and by afternoon it will be a cold weight that you return to the basket to be reheated for the night watch. But for now it is still a small, dense piece of summer that you carry with you, and you are grateful to it in the same wordless way you are grateful to the porridge and the wool and the fire. The well water is another measure of the cold's deepening. When you are relieved at midday and descend to the ward to wash your hands before the noon meal, you lower the bucket through the ice that has formed a thick, milky lid over the well shaft, breaking it with a sharp drop of the rope. The water that comes up is so cold that it feels wet in a different way from ordinary water, a liquid that seems to cling to your skin with a grip that numbs instantly. You plunge your hands into the bucket and the shock travels up your wrists and into your forearms, turning your fingers into clumsy pinkish stubs that you cannot bend properly until you have rubbed them together for a full minute. The sensation is so intense that it borders on pain, though you have felt it so many times that your mind has learned to set it aside, to observe the numbness as an interesting fact rather than a discomfort. You splash the water on your face, and the skin of your cheeks tightens into a mask that takes several long moments to soften, during which the other guards around the well do not speak, but only shake their heads slowly, a shared acknowledgement of the cold's power. Inside the guardroom, the noon meal is a hunk of bread and a thin soup made from the water that boiled the saltfish, its surface shimmering with tiny circles of oil that catch the light. You sit on the bench and soak the bread in the soup, watching it soften and crumble, and you eat slowly because there is no need to hurry. The room is dim, lit only by the fire and a single tallow candle, and the shadows in the corners are deep and soft. After the meal there is a short span of time before the afternoon duties begin, and you spend it in the company of 3 other guards who have discovered the one spot in the entire castle where the sun, when it appears, falls through a high window in the south tower and puddles on the stone floor in a square of weak, watery light. You do not remember who first found this spot, but by now it is a known place, and at this hour you and the others gather there without any arrangement, simply arriving one by one until the 4 of you are standing in the square of sunlight with your faces tilted up. The light is not warm in any real sense. It carries barely more heat than the air around it, but it is light, and your skin remembers what light means even if your mind has forgotten. You close your eyes and the insides of your lids glow a faint rosy orange, the color of the inside of a seashell, and you feel the sun on your forehead and your cheeks with a sensation that is less like warmth and more like the memory of warmth, the ghost of a summer afternoon that lingers just out of reach. The other guards stand in the same posture, their hands loose at their sides, their breathing slow and even, and no one speaks because the light is too thin to share and too precious to disturb. Overhead, the window is a narrow arch of thick, greenish glass that warps the view of the sky into a wavering blur, and a few dust motes drift through the beam, turning gold for an instant before vanishing into the shadow beyond. The square of light moves across the floor with an imperceptible slowness, creeping toward the wall as the sun slides down the sky, and you all shift your positions by half a step every few minutes without any signal, keeping your faces in the brightest part of the beam. This stance is so subtle that an observer would not notice it, but to you it is the central fact of the early afternoon, a quiet choreography of following the light as it drains away. After perhaps 20 minutes, or perhaps 40, the sun passes behind a cloud or sinks low enough that the window no longer catches it, and the square of light fades to a dull grey patch that is indistinguishable from the rest of the stone. The 4 of you stand there for a moment more, as if hoping the light will return, and then one by one you drift apart and return to your duties, carrying the memory of that faint warmth with you for the rest of the day. The afternoon stretches like taffy, a long, slow pull of grey hours that never quite darken into evening, but never brighten either. You return to the war for the late watch, and the warming stone has been reheated and returned to you, its heat now a familiar pressure against your ribs. The wind has risen a little, turning the moan in the battlements into a lower, more insistent note, and the banners on the tower snap once, twice, and then fall still. They have been snapping and falling still for months now, and you have stopped noticing them except as a brief flicker at the edge of your vision, a movement that you catalogue and disregard. The snow on the parapet has developed a hard, shiny crust where the wind has polished it, and your boots leave only shallow impressions that fill slowly with the fine, dry powder that the wind lifts and carries in thin, snaking lines across the stone. You watch the tree line or the place where the tree line should be, but today a fog has risen from the snowfields, a low, dense mist that clings to the ground and hides everything beyond the moat. The fog is the color of old pewter, and it moves with a slow rolling motion like the surface of a lake seen from a great height, its waves barely perceptible. Through it, the tops of the tallest firs poke up as dark, spiky shapes that seem to float on a sea of vapor, unmoored from the ground, and you watch them for a time while the cold stone presses upward through your boots and the heat of the warming stone presses inward against your chest, creating a strange, divided sensation of hot and cold that you have come to know as the signature feeling of this winter. There are no horns, no shouts, no sudden alarms. The siege continues in its silent, patient way, and the castle endures it with the same patience. You think about the square of sunlight in the tower and the way the dust motes dance there, and you think about the frost flowers that will bloom again tonight on the window, new patterns growing out of the same cold breath, and these thoughts are so small and so gentle that they carry no weight at all. They simply drift through your mind like the dust motes, gold for an instant, and then they are gone. And you are standing on the wall with the fog below and the wind above and the stone around you, and everything is exactly as it has been since the first snow fell, steady, quiet, and profoundly still. The shortest day arrives without ceremony. You know it has come because old Willem mentioned it the night before, tapping a finger on the ledger and noting that the sun would rise at its latest hour and set at its earliest, a span of daylight so brief that a man on the morning watch might see the dawn and the dusk in what felt like a single drawn breath. The information settles over the guardroom with the same mild interest as a report on the grain stores, and no one suggests any observance beyond the small extra portion of ale that the quartermaster has approved for the occasion. A half cup of the sour dark brew served in clay mugs that have been warmed by the hearth. You drink yours standing, the ale sharp and thin on your tongue, and then you wrap yourself in your heaviest cloak and climb the stair to the wall for the midnight watch, the watch that will straddle the pivot of the year. The night is colder than any night you can remember, a cold that does not bite so much as it presses, a steady, even weight that seems to come from all directions at once. The air is so still that it feels solid, a block of frozen silence through which you move slowly, your boots making the only sound on the packed snow of the parapet. The brazier has been filled with fresh charcoal, and it glows with a deep, steady red that pulses faintly, as if the coals are breathing. But even standing directly beside it, you feel the heat only on one side of your body, while the other side remains wrapped in the greater cold that pours down from the stars. And there are stars tonight, more stars than you have seen since the autumn, because the clouds that have hung over the valley for weeks have finally peeled back and left the sky naked and glittering from horizon to horizon. The moon is a slender crescent, low in the west, a cold silver sliver that sheds no light, and the darkness between the stars is so deep that it looks like a solid thing, a black velvet cloth spread tight across the bowl of the sky. You take your position at the merlon and you wait, and as you wait the whole castle seems to hold its breath. It begins subtly, so subtly that you do not notice it at first. The wind, which has been moaning through the battlements in its low, continuous voice for weeks, drops away to nothing. The banner on the tower, which has snapped and fallen still in its irregular rhythm, hangs now like a dead weight, its folds frozen into stiff pleats that will not shift until the next breeze comes. The creaking of the gatehouse timbers, that familiar conversation of old wood settling into cold, falls silent. Even the small, distant sounds that usually drift up from the ward below, the clink of a late bucket, the murmur of a voice from the barracks, the scuffle of the dogs turning in their sleep, all of these fade one by one, until you are left with a silence so complete that it has a presence of its own. You stand motionless in this silence, your hands in their thick gloves resting on the cold stone, and you become aware of your own heartbeat. It is not loud, not a pounding, but simply there, a steady, soft thump that you can feel in your chest and your temples and the tips of your fingers, a rhythm that you have carried with you every moment of your life, but have rarely stopped to hear. In the silence of the shortest night, with the wind gone and the castle asleep and the stars frozen in their places, your heartbeat becomes the only clock, marking out the seconds with a patience that matches the patience of the snow on the fields below. You count the beats without meaning to, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, up to 20, and then you lose count and start again. And the counting becomes a kind of meditation that empties your thoughts until there is nothing left but the beat and the silence and the cold. Then, into that silence, the tiny sounds begin to surface. They are sounds that you would never hear on an ordinary night, drowned as they would be by the wind and the creaking timbers and the general low murmur of the castle. But tonight they emerge one by one like small creatures venturing out of hiding. The first is a single drip, a drop of water falling from somewhere above you, probably from an icicle on the tower roof that has melted just enough during the faint warmth of the previous afternoon to release a bead of moisture. The drip falls through the air with a small distinct plink as it strikes the stone beside your boot, and then there is a long pause before the next drip gathers and falls, and the next after that, each one a tiny musical note that hangs in the stillness for a fraction of a moment before the silence swallows it. You listen to the drips and you note how they are not perfectly regular. Sometimes two fall close together, sometimes there is a gap so long that you think the icicle has frozen solid again, and then another drip falls and surprises you. While you are listening to the drips, another sound makes itself known from deeper inside the castle, a sound that is even fainter and harder to identify. It comes from the direction of the tower stair, and it is a soft, slow shuffle, the sound of a leather sole dragging across a stone step. Someone is walking up or down the stair, moving with the heavy, careful tread of a person who does not want to wake anyone, and you hear each step distinctly. The scuff of the sole, the slight grit of sand or salt under the leather, the pause as the walker shifts their weight to the next step. The sound rises and then fades, rising as the person draws nearer to some vent or arrow slit that carries the noise outward, and then fading as they move deeper into the tower, until finally there is only the silence again, and the drip of the icicle and your own heartbeat. The third sound comes from the storehouse, a building that is separated from the wall by the width of the ward, and whose sound should be too distant to reach you. But tonight the silence carries everything. You hear a small high-pitched squeak, then a rapid scuttling rustle that moves through what must be the straw laid over the sacks of grain. A mouse, or perhaps several mice, are busy in the stores, and you can follow their movements by the tiny noises they make, the scratch of claws on packed earth, the rustle of dry stalks being rearranged, the occasional pause of absolute quiet during which you imagine the mouse freezing in place, whiskers twitching, before resuming its work. The sound is so faint that it is more like a thought of a sound, a whisper at the very edge of your hearing, and you have to hold your breath to catch it. When you do hold your breath, your heartbeat becomes louder in your ears, and the mouse sounds become clearer, and you stand there in the dark with your lungs still and full, while the small, busy lives of the storehouse play out in your ears. You exhale after a moment, and the cloud of your breath drifts across the parapet, silvery in the starlight, and you look down from the wall at the white expanse of the outer bailey, and the frozen moat, and the dark smudge of the forest beyond. Nothing moves there. The world is asleep, and not the ordinary sleep of a single night, but a deeper, longer sleep that has been settling over the land since the first snow fell and will not lift for months. The snowfields stretch away into the darkness without a single footprint, without a single track of any animal, a smooth, unbroken sheet that glimmers faintly under the stars. It is beautiful in a way that requires no response, a beauty so still and so vast that it asks nothing of you, and you look at it for a long time while the silence continues to hold and the drips fall and the mice rustle and your heart beats on. You think, in a detached and drifting way, about the turning of the year. Somewhere beyond the mountains and the frozen valleys and the snow-choked passes, other people are marking this night with fires and songs and the slaughter of cattle, keeping the old customs that your own castle has let fall into quiet neglect. You remember a midwinter from your childhood, a bonfire on a hill, and the taste of roasted meat. But the memory is so distant and so softened by time that it feels like a story someone told you rather than something you lived. Here, in the fortress, the turning of the year is marked only by the half cup of sour ale and the deep, listening silence of the wall. And that seems to you entirely appropriate, a fitting response to a season that asks only patience and stillness and the slow counting of heartbeats. The stars have wheeled a little to the west, and you notice that the crescent moon has sunk so low that it now touches the peaks of the mountains, a silver boat coming to rest on a black shore. You watch it descend, its lower edge flattening and then dipping behind the ridge, until only a faint glow remains to mark its passage. Then that glow fades too, and the stars have the sky entirely to themselves. You search out the familiar patterns again, the hunter and the bull and the seven sisters, and you find them all in their places, unchanged, exactly as they were the last time you looked and the time before that. The concept of spring, which everyone in the castle speaks of occasionally in the same way they speak of the herb garden, feels tonight like a legend, a tale told by old people to comfort the young. You know intellectually that the year has now turned, that from this moment onward the days will lengthen and the sun will climb higher and the ice will eventually retreat. But standing on the wall in the deepest cold of the deepest night, with your breath freezing on your scarf and your heartbeat loud in your ears, that knowledge is purely theoretical. The world as it exists right now is winter, only winter, and it will be winter for a long time yet, and you accept this without resistance because acceptance is the only weapon you have against the cold. A new sound breaks the stillness, the distant, muffled chime of the chapel bell striking the hour. It rings once, twice, 3 times, and the notes hang on the air for an unusually long time, as if the silence is reluctant to let them go. 3 bells means the hour before dawn, the deepest and coldest part of the night, and you know that your watch has only a little while left to run. The bell's echo fades slowly, rippling outward across the ward and over the wall and into the snowfields, until it becomes indistinguishable from the silence itself. The mouse in the storehouse has fallen quiet. The icicle drip has slowed to a single drop every 30 heartbeats. The person on the stair has reached their destination, wherever it was, and has closed the door behind them with a soft, final thump that you felt more than heard. You shift your weight and pull your cloak tighter, settling the hood lower over your forehead, and you let your eyes rest on the glowing coals of the brazier. The warmth that reaches your face is so faint that it is more an idea of warmth than a real sensation, a slight lessening of the cold rather than the presence of heat. But it is enough to keep you standing, and you have stood in worse cold on other nights, and you will stand in worse cold on nights still to come. You yawn, a wide, slow yawn that cracks your jaw and fills your lungs with icy air, and you feel the tiredness that lives behind your eyes and in the hinge of your knees, a tiredness that has become so constant that you no longer distinguish it from being awake. The stair behind you gives its familiar creak, and you turn to see Tam emerging from the dark, with his scarf wrapped to his eyes and the fresh warming stone clutched against his chest. He gives you the blink that means relief, and you step aside from the brazier, your legs stiff and slow. You do not speak, because there is nothing to report, nothing but the silence and the stars and the drip of an icicle and the distant rustle of a mouse, and those are not things that need reporting. You walk down the stair with your hand on the rope rail, your boots finding the worn hollows in each step, and you pause at the bottom to look up one last time. The stars are still there, still bright, still turning their slow wheel, and the world is still asleep under its blanket of snow. The shortest night has passed, and the year has turned, and everything continues on in its quiet, patient way. You push open the barracks door and step inside, and the warmth of the sleeping room wraps around you like a second cloak, and you let your eyes close before you have even reached your pallet. January passes in a blur of graphite skies and long, unbroken nights, a stretch of days so uniform that you lose track of where one ends and the next begins. The sun, when it appears at all, is a pale smudge that scrapes along the southern horizon for a few hours and then sinks back into the dark, leaving behind a twilight that is neither day nor night, but a dim, suspended grayness that lasts from mid-morning until early afternoon. You measure time now by the rhythm of duties rather than by any clock, and when the master of the watch approaches you one evening with a new assignment, you receive it with the same mild acceptance you would give to a change in the wind. You are to trade your post on the wall for a week of cellar watch, guarding the sacks of grain and the barrels of salted fish in the low stone chamber beneath the quay. The guard who usually holds that post has developed a cough that rattles in his chest, and the warm, dry air of the Undercroft will do him more good than the bitter parapet. But the Undercroft still needs a guard, and so you are sent down into the belly of the castle with a lantern and a stool and instructions to keep the rats away from the winter stores. The stair to the Undercroft winds downward from the kitchen passage, a narrow spiral of worn stone that grows warmer with every step. You descend with one hand trailing along the wall, feeling the temperature rise from the sharp, dry cold of the ward through layers of intermediate coolness into a steady, earthy warmth that greets you at the bottom like a soft breath. The air here smells of damp sacking and old wood, and the faint, briny tang of the salted fish barrels. And underneath those smells there is a deeper scent, the mineral smell of the bedrock on which the castle is built. A smell that has not changed in centuries. The chamber opens out before you as a long, low room with a vaulted ceiling of rough stone, its corners lost in shadow, its floor paved with flagstones that have been worn smooth by generations of feet. Sacks of grain are stacked against the walls in neat, squared-off piles, their rough brown cloth bulging with the weight within, and beside them stand the barrels, huge oaken things bound with iron hoops, their lids sealed with a thick layer of wax that gleams dully in the lantern light. The lantern hangs from an iron hook driven into the central pillar of the vault, and its flame burns with a steady yellow glow that does not flicker because there is no draught down here, no wind, no sudden gust to make the shadows jump. The light falls on the grain sacks and the barrels and the small makeshift seat that has been arranged for you, an upturned bucket with a folded sack on top for comfort, and it casts your shadow onto the far wall as a long, dark shape that moves when you move and stills when you still. You settle onto the bucket with your back against a sack of barley, feeling the warmth of the chamber seep into your bones, and you take out the torn gauntlet that you have been meaning to mend for a week and a half. The leather of the gauntlet has split along the seam where the thumb joins the palm, a small but persistent opening that lets the cold in when you are on the wall, and you have brought a needle and a length of wax thread from the mending basket in the guardroom. The needle is a sliver of polished bone, and the thread is stiff and slightly sticky with wax, and you hold them up to the lantern light while you thread the eye with the slow, deliberate movements of a person who has all night to finish the task. The stitching begins. You push the needle through the tough leather, feeling the slight resistance as the point pierces the hide, and then you pull the thread through with a soft, whispering sound that is the only noise besides the lantern's quiet hiss. The stitch you make is a simple one, a loop that passes through both edges of the tear and draws them together, and you place each stitch with care, spacing them evenly, because a gauntlet that is mended badly will only tear again. The rhythm of the stitching is slow and calm, the needle dipping and rising, the thread pulling taut, and as you work your mind settles into a state of quiet focus that is very like the state you enter on the wall, a hovering attention that notices everything without grasping at anything. The warmth of the Undercroft wraps around you like a blanket, and the smell of grain and salt and old stone fills your nose, and the lantern flame burns on without wavering, a tiny sun in the deep dark of the earth. After a while, you hear footsteps on the stair, and old Willem descends into the chamber with a second lantern and a cup of hot water that he presses into your hand. He is not assigned to the cellar watch, but he has a habit of visiting the guards on quiet posts because he likes to talk, and the Undercroft is a good place for talking, its thick stone walls absorbing sound so that you can speak in normal tones without disturbing anyone above. He settles himself onto a nearby sack with a grunt and a sigh, arranging his long grey beard over his chest, and for a moment he simply sits there in the golden light, his eyes half closed, his breathing slow and even. Then he begins to speak, and what he speaks is a story, a rambling, gentle story about a horse that once escaped the stables and was found asleep in the chapel. The horse, he says, was a big bay gelding with a white blaze on its forehead and a temperament so placid that the stable boys called it brother, because it seemed to belong more to the monastery than to the stables. One night in the autumn of a different year, the latch on its stall was not properly secured, and a horse nosed it open and wandered out into the ward while the whole castle slept. No one saw it go. It crossed the ward in the moonlight, its unshod hooves making no sound on the cobbles, and it passed through the open door of the chapel, drawn perhaps by the warmth of the sanctuary lamp that burned there, or perhaps by the smell of the dried rushes on the floor, or perhaps by the smell of the dried rushes on the floor, or perhaps by nothing more than a quiet, horsey curiosity. And there, on the floor before the altar, it lay down with its legs folded beneath it, and its great head resting on its forelegs. And it fell asleep. And it was still asleep there when the chaplain came in the next morning to light the candles for the dawn office, a sight that caused the chaplain to drop his taper and utter a word that old Willem will not repeat in the quiet of the undercroft. Old Willem tells this story in a voice that is low and rumbling, a voice that rises and falls with the same gentle cadence as the ledger readings, and you listen while you stitch, your needle moving in and out of the leather in time with the words. The story has no grand point and no dramatic climax. The horse was discovered, the stable boy was gently scolded, the horse was led back to its stall with a handful of oats, and life continued on as before. But the image of the horse lying in the chapel, its brown coat catching the coloured light from the east window, and its breath rising in soft, regular clouds, stays with you as you work, and you think that you would have liked to see that sight, a large, calm animal, resting in a place meant for human stillness, as if the horse had understood something about the chapel that the humans had forgotten. Old Willem falls silent after the story ends, and the two of you sit together in the warmth without speaking, the lantern hissing softly, and the needle whispering through the leather, and the distant bell marking an hour that you do not count. After old Willem leaves, climbing the stair with his lantern swinging, you finish the gauntlet. The last stitch pulls the torn edges neatly together, and you tie off the thread with a small tight knot and bite the end free with your teeth. You flex the leather, working the thumb back and forth, and the seam holds firm, the repair nearly invisible in the dim light. You set the mended gauntlet aside and take a sip of the hot water, which has cooled now to a lukewarm temperature that is still pleasant on your tongue. The silence of the undercroft settles around you again, but it is a different silence from the one on the wall. It is a closer, thicker silence, a silence that has no weather in it and no stars, only the steady, patient presence of the stored food and the deep rock and the lantern flame. Above you, beyond the vaulted ceiling and the floors of the keep and the tower stairs, the wind will be screaming around the battlements, tearing at the banners and driving the snow sideways across the parapet. You know this without hearing it, because the wind has screamed every night for a month, and you can picture the guards on the wall leaning into the gusts, their cloaks snapping behind them, their faces wrapped to the eyes. But you are tucked into the belly of the castle now, where the wind cannot reach and the cold is held at bay by the mass of the stone, and the knowledge of that contrast gives you a quiet sense of shelter that you do not examine too closely. You simply sit on your bucket with your back against the barley sack and your mended gauntlet in your lap, and you let the warmth and the silence carry you into a state that is halfway between waking and sleep, a state in which your thoughts drift without direction, touching on the horse in the chapel, and the taste of salt fish and the pattern of frost on the barracks window, and then letting each one go. The bell chimes somewhere above, its note muffled by the stone floors, and you rouse yourself enough to make a slow circuit of the chamber. You walk past the grain sacks, running your hand along their rough surfaces, feeling the hardness of the packed kernels beneath the cloth. You check the wax seals on the fish barrels, each one intact, each one marked with the quartermaster's chalk symbol that tells you the contents are undisturbed. You pause at the far end of the chamber, where a small vent in the wall lets in a thin stream of air that smells of snow and cold metal, a reminder of the winter world outside, and then you turn and walk back to your bucket. The circuit takes perhaps 3 minutes, and you will repeat it several times during the night. A slow patrol that covers no distance but still serves the purpose of a patrol, giving your legs something to do, and your eyes something to do, and your eyes something to check, and your mind a small, contained task to complete. The hours of the cellar watch pass in a way that feels different from the hours on the wall. On the wall, time is measured by the movement of stars and the gradations of cold and the slow lightening of the sky before dawn. Down here, time is measured only by the lantern, which burns through its oil at a predictable rate, and by the occasional chime of the distant bell, and by the gradual accumulation of stitches in leather, or the slow emptying of a cup of water, you find that you do not mind this different measure. In fact, you find it restful, a kind of retreat from the vast, star-scattered clock of the sky into a smaller, warmer, more human scale of time. You think that you might volunteer for the cellar watch again when your week is done, though you know that the roster will rotate as it always does, and you will find yourself back on the wall soon enough, with the wind in your face and the cold stone under your boots. When the bell strikes the hour that marks the end of your shift, you rise from the bucket and stretch, feeling the pleasant ache in your shoulders from the stitching and the sitting. You check the lantern, ensuring the flame is low and steady, and you leave the chamber exactly as you found it, with the grain sack squared and the barrel sealed and the upturned bucket waiting for the next guard. The stair winds upward before you, and you climb it slowly, feeling the temperature drop step by step, the warmth of the undercroft peeling away as the cold of the upper world reasserts itself. By the time you reach the kitchen passage, your breath is visible again, and the air smells of snow and charcoal smoke, and you can hear the distant moan of the wind around the tower tops. You pause for a moment at the passage window, looking out at the ward where the snow has drifted against the well cap in a long, smooth curve, and then you walk on toward the barracks, carrying the memory of the warm cellar with you like a small private sun. The first hint of change comes not with warmth, but with sound. A faint liquid trickle that you hear during a dawn patrol when the world is still a study in deep blues and charcoal greys. You are walking the stretch of wall above the outer ditch, your boots crunching on the frozen crust in their familiar rhythm, when a new note reaches your ears from below, a soft, continuous gurgle that is unlike any sound the winter has made before. You stop and lean over the merlon, peering down into the shadowy trench that runs between the wall and the snowfields. And there, beneath a skin of ice that is still thick and white, you can just make out the movement of water running dark and quick over the stones of the ditch floor. The ice above it is solid enough to hold the weight of a man, but underneath it the melt has begun. A secret river carving a channel between the frozen surface and the frozen ground, and its voice is a low, steady murmur that speaks of something shifting deep in the fabric of the season. You listen to it for a long moment, your breath hanging in the air, and then you resume your patrol, carrying the sound with you like a small polished stone tucked into your pocket. The trickle under the ice is only the first of many small signs that begin to appear over the days that follow, each one so modest that you might miss it if you were not a guard whose life depends on noticing small changes in the texture of the world. The icicles that hang from the gatehouse eaves, which have been frozen solid since before the shortest day, start to drip at midday when the sun climbs high enough to find them over the ridge of the tower roof. You notice it first while you are crossing the ward to fetch your noon meal, a single drop of water that falls from the tip of the longest icicle and splashes onto the packed snow below with a tiny dark crater. You pause to watch, and as you watch, another drop gathers at the same tip, swelling slowly from a bead to a tear to a plump, trembling pearl that lets go and falls, and another crater appears beside the first. The drops do not fall in a steady rhythm, but in an irregular pattern, sometimes 2 or 3 in quick succession, sometimes a gap of many heartbeats, and you stand there with your bowl in your hand, watching the slow, patient work of the sun as it eats away at the winter one drop at a time. By the time the noon bell rings, the packed snow beneath the icicle is pocked with a cluster of small holes, each one a record of a single moment of melting, and the air around the gatehouse carries a faint, fresh smell of wet stone that you have not smelled in months. The sky itself begins to change, shedding its uniform grey for patches of a pale, watery blue that appear between the clouds like glimpses of a forgotten colour. These patches do not last long at first. They open for an hour in the late morning and then close again as the clouds regroup. But each day they open a little wider and stay a little longer, and you find yourself glancing upward more often than you did during the deep winter, checking the sky, as if it were a fellow guard whose mood you are learning to read. The blue is not the deep saturated blue of summer, but a thin, almost translucent shade, the color of old ice or diluted ink, and it holds no warmth that you can feel on your face, but its mere presence is a signal, a small flag flown from the heavens to say that the season is thinking about turning. The crows seem to notice it too, where before there was only the one solitary bird on the chapel roof. Now there are two, a pair that fly in from the forest each morning and perch on the same bare branch of the elm, their black feathers ruffled by a wind that has lost some of its cutting edge. They do not caw, not yet, but they sit side by side and watch the castle with their heads cocked, and their presence feels like a quiet announcement. The snow on the outer bailey has begun to soften during the afternoons, a change so gradual that you do not trust it at first. For weeks the snow has been a hard, dry crust that crunched under your boots like broken glass, but now, when the sun has been on it for an hour or two, the surface gives slightly under your weight, yielding with a soft, wet sigh instead of a crunch. Your boot leaves a print that is deeper and darker than before, the edges of the tread filling with a thin film of water that will freeze again as soon as the shadow of the wall falls across it in the late afternoon. This cycle of softening and freezing, repeated day after day, begins to reshape the drifts, rounding their sharp edges and settling them into smoother, lower forms, as if the snow itself is slowly exhaling and sinking closer to the ground. The paths that you and the other guards shoveled so laboriously during the deep winter are now wider and darker, the cobbles beneath them starting to show through, in patches where the packed snow has worn thin, dark grey islands, emerging from a white sea. On a morning when the wind has turned around to the south and carries a smell that is almost green, you are assigned to sweep the slush from the parapet gutters, a chore that the master of the watch has added to the duty roster now that the melting has begun in earnest. The gutters are shallow channels cut into the stone along the base of the merlons, designed to carry rainwater away from the wall walk, and they have been choked for months with frozen snow and ice and the accumulated debris of winter storms. You take a stiff broom of bound twigs and work your way along the eastern parapet, pushing the slush ahead of you in a slow brown wave that slides over the edge of the wall and falls into the ward below with a soft, heavy splat. The slush is a mixture of half-melted snow and grit and small frozen clumps of matter that might be dead moss or old bird droppings or fragments of leaves blown up from the forest in the autumn. And it has a smell that is cold and wet and faintly organic, the smell of things beginning to rot and thaw. Your broom scrapes across the stone with a wet, gritty sound, and the motion of the work is rhythmic and soothing, a broad, sweeping gesture that you repeat over and over as you move from merlon to merlon. The sun is on your back while you work, and for the first time since the autumn, you feel its heat as a distinct presence, a faint pressure between your shoulder blades that makes you loosen your cloak and push your hood back from your forehead. During a rest, you lean on your broom and look out over the battlement of the forest that is emerging from its winter shroud. The trees are still bare, still black, still locked in the deep sleep of the season, but the snow that has buried their roots for months is pulling back, retreating from the trunks in wide, wet rings that expose the dark, matted leaves of the forest floor. The stream that runs through the middle of the valley, a feature you had almost forgotten existed because it has been buried under ice and snow since November, is now partly visible, its course marked by a long, winding depression where the snow has collapsed into the running water below. You can hear it from the wall, a distant rushing sound that is louder than the trickle under the ditch and more insistent, the voice of a river that is waking up and remembering how to move. The sound is constant now, a background note that joins the wind in the battlements and the drip of the icicles and the occasional tentative caw of the crows. And together, these sounds form a new music for the castle, a music that is still quiet and still slow, but that has a different texture from the deep, frozen silence of midwinter. One afternoon, while you are on the south wall where a narrow ledge of rock catches the sun for the whole of the short daylight, you notice a patch of color on the stone that was not there the day before. It is a small cushion of moss, no bigger than your palm, that has emerged from a crevice where the mortar has crumbled away, and its color is a deep, vivid brownish green that seems almost shocking after the months of grey and white. You crouch down to look at it more closely, and you see that it is made of hundreds of tiny, tightly packed leaves, each one a miniature spear that points upward toward the light, and that the surface of the moss is dotted with even tinier droplets of water that sparkle faintly in the sun. You touch it with the tip of your gloved finger, and the moss is soft and springy, yielding under the pressure and then springing back, alive and resilient, despite the cold that is still in the air. This small, stubborn piece of life, clinging to a crack in the stone wall of a fortress besieged by winter, seems to you a message of a kind, a quiet declaration that the season is not endless after all. And you straighten up and resume your patrol with a feeling that is too mild to be called hope, but too warm to be called indifference. The siege has not ended. The passes are still blocked, the roads still buried, and no supply cart has been seen on the valley track since the first heavy snow. But the siege is beginning to lose its grip, not in a dramatic way, but in a slow, piecemeal way, one drip of meltwater at a time. You feel the change in your own body as much as you observe it in the world. The cold no longer bites as deeply. You can stand a full watch without needing to retreat to the brazier, and your fingers do not numb inside your gloves the way they did a month ago. The warming stones are still heated each morning, but they are carried now as a comfort rather than a necessity, and some of the younger guards have stopped wrapping them in sacking and simply hold them bare in their hands until the heat fades. The meals are still the same grey porridge and salted fish, but the quartermaster has begun to speak of the spring supplies with a tone that is less speculative and more practical, as if he is calculating not whether the supplies will come, but when, and how quickly the stores can be replenished once the pass opens. The light lasts longer now, stretching the afternoons into a thin, watery gold that lingers on the western peaks for a full hour after the sun has set behind them. You find yourself lingering on the wall at the end of your watch, watching the sky go through its slow gradations of color, from pale blue to lavender to a soft, dusty rose that fades into the deep violet of the coming night. The stars, when they appear, are the same stars you watched through the long dark of January. The hunter and the bull and the seven sisters all in their places, but they seem a little higher now, a little farther away, as if the sky itself is drawing back from the earth to make room for the spring. The wind has lost its screaming edge and blows now with a lower, steadier note, a hum rather than a howl, and when it passes over the wall, it carries the smell of wet earth and distant rain instead of the dry, metallic cold of the deep winter. You sweep the slush, you watch the dripping icicles, you listen to the river waking under its skin of ice, and with each small task and each small observation, the season shifts a little further toward its ending. The fortress endures as it has always endured, its stones warming slowly in the lengthening light, its stores holding steady, its guards walking their slow patrols on walls that are beginning to dry in patches where the sun hits them longest. The winter has been a long, quiet siege, and it is not over yet, but the first signs of thaw have arrived, and you receive them with the same calm attention you have given to every other change, as interesting facts in a world that continues to turn, slow and steady and full of small, patient wonders. The snow recedes the way it arrived, slowly and without announcement, pulling back from the castle in a series of small retreats that you notice only because you have spent so many months staring at the same stones and the same drifts that any change, however slight, registers like a bell note. One morning you step out of the barracks and see that the well cap has emerged completely from its white shell, the thatch dark and wet and steaming faintly in the thin sunshine, and beside it the cobbles are visible for the first time since the autumn, their rounded edges gleaming with moisture. You walk across the ward on stones that are still slick with meltwater, and the sound of your boots has changed from the dry crunch of winter to a wet, slapping tread that echoes off the walls in a new way, a sound that belongs to the muddy season between winter and spring, when everything drips and runs and seeps. The air is full of the noise of water now, not just the distant rush of the river, but nearer sounds too, the plink of drips from every eave and arch, the gurgle of the drain channels as they carry the melt away under the walls, the soft, continuous hiss of the snowbanks settling and collapsing as the warmth eats them from within. The long job of clearing begins in the inner ward, not the emergency shoveling of the deep winter when you had to carve paths to the well and the gatehouse, but a slower, more thorough work of sweeping and scraping and carting away the debris that the snow has left behind. You are assigned to this task along with a crew of grooms and kitchen boys and 2 other guards whose wall duties have been reduced, now that the watches are shorter and the cold less demanding. Your tools are a stiff broom of birch twigs and a wooden barrow with an iron wheel that squeaks on every rotation, a high, thin sound that cuts through the drip and gurgle of the thaw. The work takes you across every corner of the ward, From the chapel steps where the snow has melted into a shallow pond that reflects the pale sky, to the stable door where the drifts have retreated to reveal a mat of old straw and frozen dung that must be forked into the barrow and wheeled to the midden heap beyond the outer gate. The scrape of bristles on stone, the scrape of the fork on the cobbles, the squeak of the barrow wheel, all these sounds merge into a slow, steady rhythm that fills the mornings and afternoons, a rhythm that is different from the watch, but equally familiar, equally soothing in its repetition. You work alongside a groom named Sim, who has a quiet, methodical way with the broom, and the two of you fall into a pace that matches without any discussion. You sweep a section of the ward, piling the slush and grit into a low, dark heap, and he follows with the barrow and the fork, lifting the heap in small, careful loads that do not spill over the sides. The kitchen boys work nearer the wall, scraping the moss and the frozen mud from the drain channels with short-handled hose, and their voices drift across the ward as they talk about nothing in particular, the way people talk when the work is dull and the day is long. You do not listen to the words, but the sound of their voices is pleasant, a low murmuring music that blends with the squeak of the barrow and the drip of the eaves and the distant rushing voice of the river. The sun is warm enough now that you have shed your heaviest cloak and left it draped over a mounting block, and you work in your tunic with your sleeves pushed back from your wrists, feeling the air on your skin in a way that is still cool but no longer numbing. The watch shifts have grown lighter, along with the clearing work. Where before you stood for hours in the biting wind, wrapped in every layer you owned and still feeling the cold creep in, you can now stand a full 2 hours on the parapet without needing to cup your hands over the brazier or press a warming stone against your chest. The wind has settled into a steady, gentle breeze that comes from the south and carries a smell that is almost sweet, a smell of wet earth and old leaves and the first, faintest hint of growing things that have not yet broken the surface. You do not need the brazier at all on some afternoons, and the charcoal sits in its iron box, unused, while you lean on the merlon and watch the valley emerge from its winter covering. The snow on the moors has pulled back into isolated patches, white islands scattered across a sea of brown and grey, and the forest is a dense, dark mass that looks softer than it did, as if the trees have drawn up moisture from the thawing ground and their buds have begun to swell, though you cannot see them from this distance. One afternoon, a thin, watery sun breaks through the clouds and stays for the whole span of the daylight, from the late morning when it clears the eastern ridge until the early evening when it sinks behind the western peaks. The light it casts is a pale, lemony gold that makes the wet stone of the walls glisten, and the puddles in the ward shine like discs of polished metal. You are on the south parapet for the late watch, and the sun falls directly on you as you stand at your post, warming your face and your hands, and the back of your neck with a steady, gentle heat that is still surprising even after days of thaw. You close your eyes and feel the light on your lids, the same rosy glow you remember from the winter sun in the tower window, but stronger now, thicker, carrying a promise of real warmth to come. When you open your eyes, the world seems rinsed of its greyness, and you see colours that you had forgotten existed. The rich, dark brown of the wet earth in the kitchen garden, the pale green of the moss that is spread in the crevices of the chapel wall, the rusty red of the old iron gate that stands half buried in the slush, the deep blue of the sky between the thinning clouds. The work of clearing continues through the week, and as the ward emerges from its white blanket, the castle begins to reveal itself in patches and fragments, as if it is a painting that is being slowly uncovered. The cobbles of the main yard are whole and solid under the last of the slush, their colours ranging from pale grey to a dark, almost black shade where the water has pooled. The stone lip of the well is worn smooth in the middle where centuries of hands have rested, and now it is bare and dry and catching the sun. The dead grass of the chapel yard is a flat, matted brown that will take weeks of sun to green, but it is visible, and its visibility is a kind of victory. Even the old mounting block, which has been a shapeless hump of snow since November, now stands clear, its 3 stone steps leading up to a flat top where the grooms once stood to saddle the horses. There are no horses to saddle now because the horses were taken down to the lowlands before the pass closed, but the mounting block waits for them anyway, patient and empty and streaming with meltwater. As the afternoons lengthen, the dusk arrives later and later, and the colour of the sky at sunset becomes something you look forward to. It begins with a wash of pale, watery lemon, low on the western horizon, just above the black silhouette of the peaks. And then it deepens gradually into a band of lavender that spreads upward, and above that, a layer of soft, dusty rose that fades into the pale blue of the upper sky. The clouds, when there are clouds, catch these colors and hold them, turning pink and gold and a deep smoky purple that lasts for only a few minutes before fading into the uniform gray of twilight. You watch these sunsets from the wall when your watch coincides with the evening hour, and you note how each one is slightly different, how the lemon stretches a little farther one night, how the lavender deepens into violet another night, how the stars come out while the western sky is still glowing. The wet stone of the parapet reflects the colors, so that the wall itself seems to blush and then pale, blush and then pale, as the light drains out of the day. There is still no relief column on the valley track, no line of carts or riders making their way up through the mud and the remaining drifts, but the siege feels different now. It feels less like a prison and more like a place that has been suspended in time, a bubble of quiet waiting that has held you all through the dark months and is now beginning to thin at the edges, letting in glimpses of the world that exists beyond the snow. The waiting itself has become a familiar companion, and you do not strain against it or wish it away. You simply inhabit it, the way you inhabit your post on the wall, standing still and watching while the season turns at its own slow, unalterable pace. The spring will come when it comes, and you will be here when it does, and that is the whole of the matter. The kitchen garden, when you were assigned to help clear its paths, is a soggy, black expanse of exposed earth with the brown skeletons of last year's plants still poking through the mud. The rosemary bush is a gnarled, woody thing that looks dead, but is not. And when you brush your hand across its branches, the faint, sharp scent of the leaves rises up and fills the air around you. The smell is so vivid and so sudden that it stops you for a moment, and you stand there with your hands still resting on the bush, breathing in the memory of stews and roasts and warm summer evenings. The cook comes out with a basket and begins to snip the surviving sprigs, and you watch her move from bush to bush, her scissors clicking, her basket slowly filling with green. She does not speak, but she hums a tune that you remember from somewhere, a tune that old Willem might have hummed over the ledger, and the sound of it follows you back to the ward when you return to your broom and your barrow. The fortress endures, as it has endured every winter that came before this one, and as it will endure every winter that follows. You are a small part of its long, slow story, a guard who stood on the wall while the snow fell, and the ice formed, and the rations shrank, and the cold pressed down, and now you are a guard who sweeps the slush from the cobbles and watches the sunsets spread their colors across the sky, and smells the rosemary waking under the thin spring light. The siege is not over, but it is ebbing, retreating the way the snow retreats, inch by inch and day by day, and the fortress waits with the same patience it has always had. Its stones warming, its gutters running, its crows returning, its guards walking their slow, steady rounds on walls that are finally blessedly dry. The waiting spring is almost here, and when it arrives you will be ready, not with eagerness or relief, but with the calm, quiet acceptance that is the gift of the long winter. One morning you wake to a sound that has changed its character entirely during the night. The trickle and gurgle of meltwater now transformed into a full, steady rushing that you can hear even through the thick stone walls of the barracks. You dress and step outside into air that is softer than any air you have felt in 8 months, carrying a dampness that clings to your skin and a smell of wet earth and distant rain and something else, something green and alive that you cannot name but that your body recognizes. The ward is nearly clear of snow now, only a few shrinking patches remaining in the corners where the sun never reaches, and the cobbles are dark and wet and gleaming under a sky that is a pale, even grey, the kind of grey that promises more melt rather than more snow. You walk toward the gatehouse to begin your morning watch, and as you pass the well you notice that the bucket rope has been left hanging in the sun to dry, its fibers dark with moisture and steaming faintly, a small domestic detail that tells you the castle is beginning to think about the ordinary business of life again. The wall is wet under your boots, and the stone has a different color now, a deeper, richer gray that shows the marks of every chisel and every mason's stroke, the history of the fortress written on its skin. You take your post at the Merlon and look out over the valley, and what you see is so different from the white emptiness of winter that you stand still for a long moment simply looking. The snow has pulled back from the moors entirely, leaving a landscape of brown and olive and the palest, earliest green, a wash of colour that spreads from the foot of the outer wall all the way to the dark line of the forest. The trees themselves are still bare, but their branches have a different quality now, a softness at the tips where the buds are forming, and the whole forest seems to be holding its breath, waiting for the signal to unfold. The stream that runs through the valley floor is no longer a hidden presence under ice, but a visible, moving ribbon of silver that catches the grey light and carries it downstream in flashes. And its voice is a constant, low roar that fills the air and seems to shake the ground beneath you. A voice that says the season has turned, and the water is going home to the river, and nothing will stop it now. The pass is muddy but passable. You can see it from your high post, a dark, winding scar on the side of the mountain where the snow has melted back to reveal the road beneath, and the sight of it open after so many months of white closure is strange and almost unsettling, as if a door you had grown used to being locked has suddenly swung wide. The pass has been closed since the first heavy snow of the autumn, and its opening means that the siege is lifting, not with a grand event or a dramatic arrival, but with the slow, inevitable retreat of winter. The same way a tide goes out without ceremony. You watch the road for a while, your forearms resting on the wet stone, and you think about the world that exists beyond the mountains, the towns, and the farms, and the markets, where people have been going about their own winters, unaware of the small fortress that has been floating in its sea of snow. The thought is abstract and distant, a recognition rather than a longing, and after a moment you let it go and return your attention to the immediate world of the wall. The supply cart appears in the late morning, when the grey sky has brightened to a pale silver, and the sun is trying to push through the clouds in thin, diffuse beams that fall on the valley like a blessing. You see it first as a small, dark shape moving slowly up the track from the direction of the pass, a shape that resolves gradually into an ox with wide, curving horns and a wooden cart that creaks and sways with every turn of the wheels. The cart is driven by a farmer you do not recognize, a figure in a patched brown cloak who walks beside the ox with one hand resting on its flank. And as the cart draws nearer, you can see that it is loaded with bundles and sacks, and a large, covered crock that sloshes when the wheels hit a rut. The farmer raises a gloved hand and waves it slowly toward the gatehouse, a gesture that is not urgent or dramatic, but simply a greeting, the way someone waves to a neighbor they have not seen in a while. And one of the gate guards waves back with the same slow, calm motion. The gate creaks open below you, a sound that you have not heard in its full, deep-throated voice for months, because the small postern door has been used for the outside chores and the main gates have been sealed with ice and frost. The iron hinges groan, and the heavy oak beams shudder as the gatekeepers lean into the work, and then the gates swing wide and the supply cart rolls through into the ward, its wheels squelching in the mud that has collected just inside the arch. You watch from the wall as the cart comes to a halt near the well, and the castle's small population begins to gather around it, not in a rush, but in a slow, steady trickle, people emerging from the kitchen and the stables and the chapel to see what the winter has finally delivered to them. The farmer unhitches the ox and leads it toward the water trough while the quartermaster begins to unload the cart, lifting out sacks that you can see are filled with onions and hard, pale cheeses wrapped in cloth and bundles of dried herbs that release their scent into the damp air. There is a sack of letters, too, a canvas bag tied with a leather cord, and the master of the watch takes it gently and carries it toward the keep, where it will be sorted and read and passed around until every scrap of news from the outside world has been absorbed and discussed and set aside. You are not relieved of your post because the wall still needs a guard even when the siege is lifting, and so you remain on the parapet while the life of the castle stirs below you. The sun has come out fully now, and the light is a warm golden color that falls on the wet stones, and the returning faces, and the ox drinking deeply from the trough, and you feel the sun on the back of your neck, with a sensation that is no longer faint or tentative, but solid and real, a steady heat that seeps through your tunic and loosens the muscles that have been tight for so many months. You close your eyes for a moment and let the warmth settle into you, and when you open them again, the world seems a little brighter, a little sharper, the colors more distinct, and the sounds more clear. The crows are calling from the elm tree, a series of rough, cheerful calls that break the long silence of their winter watch. And somewhere in the kitchen, a door is propped open, so that the fresh air can flow through and carry away the stale smell of charcoal and tallow. The afternoon passes in a gentle, unhurried way, while the castle slowly returns to its ordinary rhythms. A kettle is brought outside and set over a fire of sticks in the middle of the ward, and the cook fills it with water from the well and adds a handful of the dried herbs from the supply cart, and soon the smell of mint and something floral drifts up to the wall and mingles with the smell of wet stone and sun-warmed earth. Voices rise from below, a little louder than they have been for months, because the siege has lifted and people can speak without the hush that winter imposed on them, that they still speak calmly and without excitement, their words carrying up to you in fragments that you do not try to piece together. The chapel bell rings for the noon hour, and it seems to ring a little longer than usual, its notes hanging on the warm air and spreading out over the valley where the river runs and the trees wait to bloom. You finish your watch and are relieved by Tam, who gives you the slow blink and then adds a single word, spring, spoken through his scarf in a tone that is almost wondering. You nod, because the word is enough, and you descend the stair with your hand on the rope rail, stepping carefully on the wet stone that is now dry in most places, but still slick in the shadowed corners. In the ward you pause beside the well, and watch the farmer repack his cart with empty sacks and the thanks of the quartermaster, and then you walk on toward the guardroom, where a portion of the new cheese has been laid out on the table, along with a loaf of bread that is softer than any bread you've eaten in months. The cheese is pale and crumbly and tastes of the summer pastures where the cows grazed, and you eat it slowly while old Willem reads from the ledger in his rumbling voice, though today he is not reading the harvest accounts, but a list of supplies received on this day, and the numbers are all additions rather than subtractions. The long winter siege ends not with a victory or a surrender, but with the quiet, patient return of spring and the continuation of your peaceful watch. You return to the wall for the evening shift, and the sun is low and golden, casting long shadows across the ward and painting the mountains in shades of rose and amber. The air is cool but not cold, and you stand at your merlon with your cloak loose around your shoulders, watching the valley darken, and the stars come out one by one in the pale blue sky. The river is a faint silver thread in the dusk. The forest is a dark, soft mass that rustles with the first evening breeze, and the pass is a pale line that leads out into the wider world where other people are living their own lives, unaware of the long, quiet winter that has just ended in this small stone fortress on the edge of the mountains. You will be here when the summer comes, and you will be here when the winter returns, because that is what a guard does. But for now, the season has turned and the world is waking, and the watch goes on, steady and calm, and profoundly at peace.